Aloha and welcome to another episode of Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Hevelin, and today we'll be talking about crafting livable communities. I'm joined today by Elliot Van Wee, a community organizer and recent addition to the executive committee of the Oahu chapter of the Sierra Club, correct?
That is correct.
And so I believe you and I met as one of your sort of flagship projects. The BYK project was kind of coming to completion. How did you get involved with that, and what were its intents?
So that's a very long and interesting story. Actually, a friend of mine, Alex Broner, had made the BYK project part of his capstone for the Masters in Urban Regional Planning at UH, and that was back in 2011. And he did all this research. He got community groups together and made a complete streets vision plan for Beretania, Young, and King. And it kind of got put on the back burner for a few years. And believe it or not, it was at a house party with a lot of planners there. He started telling me about it. And it sounded really cool. I was very supportive of all of the concepts within it. And I started working with him.
Yeah. So BYK then standing for Beretania, Young, and King.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the corridor created by the streets, those three streets. Yeah.
Running through Honolulu.
Yeah, it bisects a good portion of Honolulu.
And so when you say complete streets, what does that entail?
So complete streets is under the larger umbrella of smart growth, and it's improvements to transportation, and especially alternative modes of transportation, getting away from just being totally car focused. Improvements to busing, biking, walking, and taking transit.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of that broader notion of today's crafting livable communities, seeing complete streets then as an avenue, no pun intended, for multimodal transport, to sort of step away from the car dominance that we see.
That's right. And, you know, I guess you could say that car dominance started in about the 50s, and maybe around the year 2000, I mean, the concept wasn't created around there, but people started to take it much more seriously, at least in the United States. Yeah.
And so that car sort of dependency or reliance has really, I think, impacted the way that our communities have formed, sort of, whereas originally, say, roadways were social spaces, communal interaction opportunities just in the day-to-day walking around, whereas with the advent of the automobile, it was more that we have sort of drive-by architecture and sort of a different feel for how roadways are used. So is complete streets a mechanism then that you guys were looking at to sort of return community to transportation? Or?
Absolutely. It could be said that that car-dominated landscape isn't very human, and the communities based solely around cars aren't really so fun or comfortable or safe to walk around in and just go about your everyday life, living, working, playing. It doesn't feel human as a neighborhood.
So how did you get into this kind of work? Is it you were walking through a neighborhood one day and didn't feel good and decided to start organizing to change things, or what drove you to it?
That's a very good question. I studied urban planning also, as well as future studies in graduate school. And I was really interested in smart growth in general, closed loop cities, and transportation is a big hunk of that. If you want to live in a more compact space and use less resources, you have to design your city in very specific ways and more welcoming ways. So that was something I was looking at. I do personally use alternative transportation myself. I bike quite a lot. So it came naturally to me, and it's very interesting. And I want to see our city more comfortable for people to travel around in, living, working, playing in their everyday life.
So you mentioned smart growth a couple of times. What would be a sort of a broad definition for that?
So smart growth, broad definition, it's improvements to the urban landscape so that they are more attractive as residential space. And maybe the high bar goal is so that people might actually prefer to live in an urban space as opposed to again, to go along with the car-dominated culture, the kind of 50s vision, the nuclear family, the little picket fence, suburban home, two-car garage, all of that. So we can preserve green space, live more healthy in our cities, lower emissions, cost of materials, all of these things, and actually have it preferable to live in a city.
So we could kind of contrast that suburban or sprawl based with, I like to phrase it sometimes as dumb growth, where it's that sort of just like ceaseless trampling of what were sort of rural hinterlands or peri-urban spaces as cities grow without much concern for the structure or the form of the city itself, and then we end up with a whole slew of problems from massive traffic to issues with just income distribution across cityscapes and limited access to services or whatever it might be. And so smart growth then is sort of a contrast to that, looking at how we can integrate the variety of different sort of human needs into our urban and even peri-urban landscapes.
Yeah, it's a reaction to all of the blissful ignorance we've been talking about, you could say.
And so in terms of the work of the BYK project itself, what became of that, or what was the intent and the outcome?
Okay, so I had mentioned it was a complete streets project on the corridor created by Beretania, Young and King. And we wanted to do a number of different things. We were exploring protected bike lanes and or cycle tracks. And to differentiate those, a cycle track is much wider than a bike lane, and it is physically separated by some sort of barrier from moving traffic. So we wanted those on Beretania, Young, and King, some combination. And we also were looking at designated bus lanes for the 1 and the 2, as those were the highest ridership going through the area. And also bulb outs, which are little extensions at the corners of streets so that the crosswalks are shortened a bit. Pedestrian islands, those little hunks of cement in between the crosswalk as kind of like a safety zone. And things like that are good for the Keiki and Kupuna, the young and the old. And we actually have the highest rate of fatalities for old folks just moving around in their communities in the nation. So this is a very real concern.
That's transportation-related fatalities.
That's right.
Yeah.
Pedestrians being hit by some other mode of transit. Yeah. Yeah, and it was a long political journey where, how should I go on from there?
Well, so as an outcome, I mean, it seems like we now have the cycle track. We have got a protected bike lane. Somewhat, I think, from my understanding at least, it seems like there was an outgrowth from the interest that was garnered in the community for the BYK project and sort of the galvanizing of support that then was transferred to some degree into what has become the cycle track.
That's accurate. It was very much bottom-up, grassroots. We started with some small community workshops in 2011, and from those workshops, we kind of gleaned information about what people living in that corridor wanted in their neighborhood and things they felt were problematic. And those are kind of the things I was going over earlier. No alternatives. It's not safe. It's not comfortable. It's not enjoyable. And then we took that to neighborhood boards. And the first neighborhood board to endorse was Neighborhood Board 8, Mokali Mo'ili'ili. Thank you, Ron Lockwood. So came up from there, and that was really my role, actually, in the project. You could say it was 90% complete when I came on board, 80 or 90%. We explored many options for the corridor in the rough makeup of the things I've been suggesting, but the plan itself was more or less complete. So I was helping with the political side of it a lot and getting endorsements from different community members. And initially we met with some of the city departments. We met with DPP, DDC and DTS.
Can you unpack those for us?
I can unpack those. I was thinking I might need to when I was saying them. Department of Transportation, Department of Design and Construction, and Department of Planning and Permitting. And the cool thing is they were very willing to meet with us and sit down and have a talk. They were curious about what it was we were doing. And we had met with neighborhood boards at that point, and we had a growing number of petitions. And I can say, in the end, we ended up having about 1,000 signatures. And at a certain point, we did start moving our efforts towards getting larger endorsements and kind of moving away from the community signatures. But when we met with the city departments, they were already looking, I should say, at doing a cycle project on King Street. The mayor had said, I want to do something on King Street. And we basically went in there with the mindset that we were going to make that the greatest possible cycle-related piece of infrastructure we could have. And so that was a low-hanging fruit. We focused on that first out of the 4 main components of the BYK project because we knew it was attainable and we could push for something very progressive because it was kind of coming down the pipeline already. But we started very, very far away from where it is today. Initially, the mayor had gone and visited Chicago, and he was looking at some of their facilities. Not all of their facilities are this way, but a fair number of them have cars parked right up against the bikeway. It's a single-lane bikeway, so it's about half as wide as the cycle track, so it's 4 or 5 feet. And the physical barrier was defined by the parked cars, and those parked cars were right up against it. So the car doors would actually
like
open into it.
Huge door problem.
Yes, and that's called being doored.
Yeah.
It's not fun.
Not ideal.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that part of your role as that sort of community organizer is taking, in some ways, attracting, galvanizing interest from a wide diversity of community stakeholders, then translating that into sort of neighborhood board interest, and then leveraging that further into broader endorsements from, say, city departments.
I suppose so, yeah. The city departments, I don't know if you could say that they endorsed it per se. We got,
Well, he's sitting down at the table with them.
yeah.
But it seems
I
like
suppose you could. They eventually decided to do it, but formal endorsements came from other community groups, some nonprofits and things like that.
So with that sort of title of community organizer, do you see that as a role that has considerable utility, or is that something that's needed in every sort of community project? Because I would think that for just sort of Joe on the street to show up to, whatever nonprofit or decision maker, legislator to say, hey, like, we've got this great idea, that you really have to have your backing of a certain sort of cohort of the population to really kind of even get to the table.
Yeah. So I think I'm okay at bringing people together, and I'm fortunate enough to know people from many different social circles, and sometimes people don't know the other kind of people they need to know to get their projects done and to improve their community. And I enjoy bringing people together and getting things done. I have a wide array of interests, and basically, you can take a bare bones model and apply it to a wide array of projects, but it goes back to what you're saying. I mean, like, kind of garnering that support and get the community involved, show our elected officials that people care about these things, get the expertise involved, get people, with the real expertise in the community on top of just the citizen participation to move things forward and say, like, I'm an expert, I agree with this. This goes along with the values of our organization.
Nice. Well, we'll hear in a little bit after the break about some of the other organizations that you've been becoming involved with, and join us back here in a second.
Hi, I'm your host on Think Tech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, Think Tech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
All right, aloha and welcome back to Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Hevelin, and we're joined here today talking about crafting livable communities with Elliot Van Wee, a community organizer and executive committee member of the Sierra Club. And so before we went to the break, you were waxing on some of the utility of community organization. What other types of organizations have you found yourself involved with as a byproduct of the sort of various circles that you're a part of and interests that you have?
Well, I found myself involved not too long ago with this really cool organization called PermaBlitz. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Shameless plugging, thank you.
Okay, no problem. Also, Surfrider, Sustainable Coastlines, Xerophobia, the American Diabetes Association, Sierra Club. It's a good little
That definitely
list there.
sounds like you're keeping busy.
Yeah.
And so in your participation in a lot of these organizations, it seems like that frequently you're cast in a role of one that makes connections, at least from what I've seen. Is that something that you learned as a process, or something that you've just kind of like come upon, or was there, is that something just that you've always done?
That's a great question. You caught me off guard with that one.
Oh.
No, I think maybe it comes naturally to me to a certain extent from my wide array of interests, and I'm a fairly sociable guy. I like talking to all different kinds of people, hearing different opinions, and there's so many great things I want to do and you know, change my neighborhood and our shared neighborhood on behalf of everyone, help them do that. I guess I also, at the same time, I did learn a lot of this just on the job, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
I just went in there and started doing it, I guess. As simple as that, I suppose I did kind of just start doing it.
And so I know that in that broad array, you were up to some things even before our show today, correct?
Yeah. This morning, we had a Divest UH meeting with the Budget and Finance Committee of the Board of Regents at the university for the UH system, the whole system. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, unanimous support. It will be moving to the full Board of Regents meeting, I believe. And anyway, they're going to look at exploring it further and hopefully divesting soon. And
so it being divesting.
Right, divesting from fossil fuels, divesting UH's investment portfolio of fossil fuels, which is a big movement right now. I think we would be the 14th college to do so. And it's a great way to galvanize the larger movement, and really it speaks a lot. An institution of higher learning that has these values, these stated values in sustainability and things like that. It's very important that they lead by example, in my opinion.
Nice. And so in your role, your new role, correct, with the Sierra Club, what does that entail, and how did you find yourself there?
So believe it or not, I found myself there with the BYK project initially. I wanted the Sierra Club's endorsement, formal endorsement, for the BYK project. And that's also how I found myself at the American Diabetes Association, by the way. But, and then of course I end up helping them with many of their projects too, because they're all doing great things and it's fun. But with the Sierra Club, I suppose you could say I met a lot of people there that I could identify with, people who care about conservation, some very bright political folks who can be very tactful and strategic in pursuing these things, and they care about smart growth as a strategy for preserving land on the island and green space and lowering emissions, and it was a natural fit. I eventually helped with all different projects like the grid modernization bill, and now I'm a member very recently. Within the last month or so, I'm a member. But anything I say today, I'm not speaking, I'm here as a private citizen.
Full disclosure. Yeah.
Full disclosure.
So what are some of the things, I guess we could say unofficially, that are sort of on the horizon for Sierra Club in terms of interest, or projects that you guys are sort of like standing on the shoulders of successes in prior years?
So the grid modernization bill, like I just mentioned, was a pretty big one, which kind of framed the right to solar, chiefly solar, but renewables, the right to connectivity, almost as like a human right, so that HECO could not deny that and say, your neighborhood is oversaturated, therefore you cannot connect. And it was really interesting going out in different communities, and we were in Waimanalo and Eva and all over, and you'd go to someone's house and all of them would have, like a circle of homes would have solar, but then the neighbor in their backyard would say that I got a letter from HECO and they said I can't connect, and they're going to do a study, and then I can come, maybe I'll be able to connect in 18 weeks. Or so it was a little bizarre, the patchwork of who was and was not allowed to connect. Yeah, and I guess we're also very involved with Koa Ridge, Envision Laie, Turtle Bay, and those are kind of poor examples of sprawl.
Dumb growth.
Dumb growth,
Yeah.
as you like to say, which I'm going to start saying that, by the way. Yeah, it's dumb growth, and it's taking up some of our little green space left on the islands, sometimes even taking valuable agricultural land, and it's just not fitting with what we say we want to do in the future. It's dressing itself up as something really clever and progressive, and it's falling in line with transit-oriented development and smart growth, and it's not. Yeah, simply not.
Connecting two problems with an efficient transportation system doesn't necessarily mean they're not problems.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's actually, some of these places are quite far away from the proposed rail hubs. So, and I believe it's about a half a mile. If new residential space is created more than a half a mile away from a rail hub, then it's expected that people will take their car there, and that we don't want the rail hubs to become giant parking lots. So, yeah.
So I know that in previous discussions that you and I have had, that you've expressed an interest in urban agriculture and sort of city farming. Where did that come from, and where does that interest lie?
So I guess that would have to do with the closed-loop cities that I was looking into when I studied planning and future studies.
So when you say a closed-loop city, what does that entail?
Well, it's a city that can produce all of its foodstuffs within its boundary, and it also can produce its energy within its boundaries. It's self-sustaining. It's a self-sustaining city.
That's a lofty goal.
It is a lofty goal. It's a very lofty goal. It's not impossible, though. A lot of places are getting quite close to it, arguably already there. That's a very long story, but yeah, and I started looking at food miles and the distance, and that's the distance at which agricultural stuffs have to travel to the people who actually end up eating it. And of course, we import 80 to 90% of our food, 85 to 90% of our food here, and we're the most energy dependent state in the nation. So it's especially great to look at these kind of solutions for often island countries with very large populations who are actually very reliant on other places.
So you're looking at sort of reducing food miles by producing in the city. What are some of the technologies or approaches to that closed loop city that you've come across?
Okay. So of course you and I have talked about this before. I'm a very big fan of vertical farming. And the initial concept for vertical farming is quite a bit different than what most people are talking about when they speak of it these days. The original concept, I think his name was, I will say his last name wrong. It's like Dixon de Pommier or something like that. And he was basically envisioning a skyscraper greenhouse, a like hermetically sealed 40-story thing, and maybe on average these were going to produce 4 to 6 times the output per acre, use about 1/20th the water. They had a very high upfront costs, and there's a big energy barrier if they weren't taking advantage of a lot of natural lighting. So those were issues, but it was a way to grow potentially quite a lot of food in an urban area and be more self-reliant. It's also good for preparedness in disaster situations if you can grow more of your food. Not that that's the only way to do it. I know you have a very different approach with permablitz, you could say.
Well, I think it's interesting just that when the notion of city food production really, from the vertical farming approach, kind of just borrows from the notion of from the perspectives towards city real estate, right? So it's like the value is in the sky above the land. Whereas I guess a lot of my approach is more like trying to value land and utilize that.
And you know, I also highly value your approach, I guess. And I mean, it's part of what we need for livable communities. Smart growth, people need green space in the city, and community gardens are a great way to do that. Urban food forests, edible plants, and especially ones that can absorb stormwater. I don't know if Raf Bergstrom was talking about that the other week. But yeah, I mean, green space in urban areas is a very important thing. Food production is only one piece of that.
Yeah, I was reading something pretty interesting the other day talking about micro-urban spaces, and frequently the sort of like ecosystem services understanding in urban areas largely recognizes the issue that come from the fragmented nature of urban green. And so that there's a park here, there's a little green strip there, there's some grassy patch, and that ends up from a habitat size, from a sort of a biodiversity perspective, that patch size becomes very important. And so whether it's looking at sort of like continuous productive urban landscapes, which is sort of like a decade-old approach to almost having like a transect of productive green throughout the city, or really in the gradient from the city into the sort of rural areas, that we can also kind of even be conceptualizing it in this very, very, very small patch size, where we're looking at the easement between the road and the sidewalk, those little green strips, and looking at those as possible mechanisms to try and quantify even like what are some of the ecosystem services that come from that. And I read another study that was actually looking at some of those, the utility of not necessarily just food production in the use of green space, but just human interaction, so cultivated landscapes in the city. And they did a study where they were analyzing the biodiversity that happens in these cultivated landscapes, or at least we could say managed landscapes as opposed to just like a vacant lot. And had some pretty interesting results where they had found that while the social utility of, say, urban agriculture has been recognized for a long time, and for a long period has sort of, I could say, outweighed the recognized ecological utility, because it's just a good place to be. It's a opportunity for social interaction, and sort of like we were talking about the changes in how roadways are used, that carries over to our landscapes as well as we become more, or rather less sort of wedded to the land, that there's less just opportunities for social interaction. And so the cultivation of these landscapes was beneficial both for the communities and the people in them, but then they also were able to get some metrics together particularly for these smaller urban production zones where they had benefits in like species biodiversity and sort of a neat little notion to start conceptualizing or reconceptualizing what are frequently seen as these like kind of wayward or interstitial spaces within the city.
Yeah, that's excellent. You know, even what might have seemed like crazy things, urban beekeeping's taking off, and of course we can do a lot. You know, like you're getting at the ecological benefits, and just another. You're making me think of another small factor which people often overlooked. Improving our air quality in cities is a huge thing, and some people are looking to very specific plants to do that in all sorts of urban spaces. Even bioclimactic architecture, plants cascading off of buildings, it's all great stuff. I love it.
All right, well, we can talk about that more after the break.
Okay, I'm Jay Fidel, that's Ray Starling. We co-host a show called Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, every Wednesday, 4 to 5 p.m. It's really interesting. You know, Ray has a way of unzipping these guys. He asks them these questions and all this stuff tumbles out, and we find out stuff we would never know about without Ray's questions. Thank you, Ray.
You're welcome, Jay. I'm very pleased to be your Ed McMahon every Wednesday at 4 o'clock here on the internet. So you can join us and see what's happening in the energy world, and there is a lot going on. So join us every Wednesday at 4 o'clock.
Yeah, come around, be energized right here on Think Tech. Aloha.
All right, aloha and welcome back to Sustainable Hawaii. I'm your host, Hunter Hevelin, joined today by Elliot Van Wee. We're talking about crafting livable communities, and you just gave us a magnificent word that I actually had not come across before, bioclimactic architecture.
Yeah, that's by a gentleman named Ken Yeong, and I believe he's done a lot of work in Singapore and Malaysia. And one big portion of that is air quality. Like we were just wrapping up the last segment talking about that. We do have one example of this. It's an okay example. It's a step in the right direction. There is, on the edge of Kaka'ako near Ward, a big parking garage that has what looks like basically a blanket of green cascading off of the side of it. And that is an example of bioclimactic architecture. But there's really no reason why we can't have all sorts of beneficial plants basically growing off of any space in our cityscape.
Well, and it's a neat notion of looking at how we can moderate, you know, sort of the urban heat island effect, the nature of just increased warmth that comes from a increased hardscape in cities. As you mentioned, air quality, moderating water flow. So there's a lot of utility that can come from that. How do you see that fitting into sort of the dream of the city, or in terms of your idealized sort of cityscape?
That's a great question. You have so many great questions. I can see why you do this.
It's my job.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's interesting. That's something we're moving into tackling very soon here. And it's a global issue as well. Our population is still increasing ever steadily across the globe. You know, I think in 2008, for the first time ever, more than 50% of the world's population was living in cities. And if I'm not mistaken, about there's going to be 420,000 new residents in Hawaii by 2030, and 243,000 of them are going to be on Oahu. So that's going to create a whole slew of unique challenges. And
Definitely.
we already have an affordable housing problem. And we're going to have to really reimagine the way in which we live. It will quite likely mean smaller living spaces. Again, kind of going back to our first segment, the end of the nuclear family home, the 50s white picket fence thing, which to me is great. I'm very excited about that. There's plenty of other places in the world where this is already a fairly normal thing, living in much smaller space, like Tokyo or something like that. And increasingly, younger folks don't want as big of places. They want to live in urban areas. They don't want to own a car. They want to spend time outside of their house, living, working, playing in their community, go out with their friends at the bar, their family at the park, we're less interested in that. So that's okay, but we still do have a lot of interesting challenges coming up related to that.
Yeah, there was an article in The Atlantic talking about the sort of shifting dreams of the millennials and the waning interest in single-family home ownership, in car ownership. And I feel like I've had a number of conversations with folks in our demographic that often paint this picture of interest in a city that sort of embraces mixed use, that embraces multimodal transport, that embraces sort of urban design as something that is calculated, something that is engaged with by a broader set of the population than there is currently. And I think it sort of brings up some interesting questions in terms of what we're likely to see here on Oahu. And so you mentioned sort of Koa Ridge or Ho'opili, and that the mechanism by which a lot of these housing shortages are still being addressed is large tract homes out on the west side. And it sort of begs the question of who are those going to be for, and also who's going to be able to afford them.
Right. Well, fortunately, there is an interest in building denser homes, affordable homes, which that's a whole other debate, how you define affordable, as you know. But they are looking at making, comparatively, what is more affordable homes, denser development along the rail, some big land swaps happening, hopefully. Old Dole land, now owned by Castle and Cook, swapping some of that out for land along the rail, some great new agricultural projects, like the Whitmore project and things like that. And, you know, to tie into what we were talking about earlier, general sustainability, self-reliance, and subsistence here. We do, along with these challenges, as fuel prices increase, our food is more difficult to produce. And we, dealing with the smart growth, we're also trying to do a 20 to 30% agricultural subsistence by 2030. So all of these things are, you know, coming together. And we are going to have more affordable, denser rental, mostly along the rail to begin with. And we do need to think very seriously in a calculated way, as you say, and really plan these things so that it's desirable to the people who will be paying for them and living in them and raising their families in them over the next generation. And yeah, all of this needs to be very carefully considered.
Well, I think with a median house price of $720,000, $719,000, that for a lot of folks in our age range, it's all, you know, a lot of questions come up about how that would be affordable and the types of incomes. And when we relate that again to the sort of persistent call for diversifying our economy in the state, I know that there's been sort of growing interest in what's often termed as the innovation economy. There's been the blue startups, there's the high-tech development corporation. And so various entities that have come about to sort of support this innovative industry. But that's largely, I would say, populated by folks that are millennials, that are younger, that are we're digital natives. And that's the same demographic that is also less interested in car ownership and less interested in home ownership, but still a large majority, or at least a significant portion of the amount of what will be conceivably affordable housing or housing in general that's slated to be developed is, you know, pretty far out from our urban center. And it makes me wonder what the sort of eventual impacts of that will be if we're almost kind of selling ourselves short in our capacity to diversify our economy because we're attracting a different type of interest, and sort of the shorter term goals or gains economically from, you know, upticks in the construction industry may later be forsaking sort of a longer term diversification that could come in really increasing density in our urban areas.
Yeah, like we've said, I mean, a few of these projects, some of these things were proposed like more than a decade ago. I think Koa Ridge is an example of that. And since that ball sort of started rolling all the way back then, before we started making a more aggressive turn at really thinking about these things in a new way. All of this transit-oriented development and more affordable homes, smaller urban spaces, smart growth, crazy millennial stuff. They started, and
Yeah, there's sort of a legacy where
Yeah.
I know many of these lands had been slated for development for, in some cases, even 40 years. You know, they're within, in some instances, the primary urban center or the urban growth boundary. And so from a state perspective, saying, oh, we're not going to allow these land use shifts, it's probably not the most diplomatic way to go about it. So I think there has to be some type of give and take for allowing or seeding some of these spaces, some of these more rural or agricultural areas into development, but that should definitely be counterbalanced by an avid notion of sort of the renewal of, and in many ways, the creation of an urban Honolulu.
well, what do people always say? That we have a problem with reluctant urbanism? Is that how it goes? I mean, we really are quite urban on Oahu already. But we're still not really doing it right, is the larger problem, and it, gets at the root of all the things we're talking about. I am optimistic, though. I mean, I think we are doing a lot of things we need to, and you and I know a lot of people are working very hard to change these things and kind of change the course of these things. And yeah, I'm optimistic. I think we will figure this out.
So what do you see as, do you see the sort of community organization then as a key mechanism to work towards some of these goals? And if so,
Yeah.
what does that look like? Or how do you bring that into practice?
So I could tie it back to BYK, for instance. I mean, without having organized and pushed for this very progressive vision, and we've only got a small part of the overall vision plan accomplished, but it is the first cycle track in the state, and we were pushing for it about 4 months before anyone else in the community knew what it was or heard about it at all, and so that was wonderful. And without having organized and had the bottom-up grassroots movement on this, it wouldn't have happened. I mean, I don't think we would have a cycle track on King Street if we hadn't got in there. It was several months before last year's TOD symposium. And
COD being transit-oriented development.
that is right. And it took a long time. It took about 8 months. And then with all the endorsements and the community support and talking to the city departments, we did pass a resolution at the city council level. And I think that was the final, the tipping point. That's what made it happen. And
So what do
without people doing things like that, for all of the issues we've been talking about, they won't happen. We need millennials. We need millennials who have a different vision, who are going to be living in this space and raising a family here potentially, to fight for these things, because we're thinking about them in a new way, and we have a pretty keen understanding of how things ought to be, perhaps.
Entitled opinions, yes. So what do you have your sights set on in the short, medium, say even longer term? Like where else do you see you focusing your efforts towards galvanizing that interest, and what are some of the sort of acupuncture points for making some of those shifts come into play?
Well, fortunately, some of those points have already been pricked, you could say. After it was kind of realized that, for instance, with Complete Streets, the Complete Streets mandate was passed at the city and county of Honolulu level in 2012, and it said, please consider Complete Streets when you're doing repaving in city property, and people weren't really following it, to be honest, and it took a long time. I mean, just because you pass this mandate, it doesn't it's not like flipping a light switch and then institutionally everyone working there suddenly knows how to do this. They've never done it before. Some of them went to school a very long time ago. Fortunately, there are a lot of great people working in the city who are very willing to try new things. So there's great people, but as an institution, it moves very slowly. And you can't expect those things to happen overnight. Along those lines, a interdepartmental complete streets working group that ended up having over 100 city employees from every city department was formed about a year after, I guess it was it was shortly after the BYK resolution was passed, actually. And now they're very aggressively pursuing complete streets.
Well, it seems like that the community organizing aspect is a mechanism by which, when we can gather ourselves together, we can all sort of jump on that pry bar to foist our institutions just incrementally into the future.
Agreed.
Along with us. So thank you very much for joining us today. And
Thanks for having me.
sharing all of your Monotlin experience with crafting livable communities. And once again, we're joined by Elliot Van Wee, community organizer, executive committee member of the Sierra Club's Oahu chapter. I'm your host, Hunter Hevelin. Catch us here every Thursday at 2 p.m. for Sustainable Hawaii. Aloha.